In the realm of the early 19th century, a period ravenous for beauty and allure, there existed a fascination with ladies who possessed a form so bewitching, so curvaceous, that it drew admirers like moths to a flame. These were the prime years when European societies hungered for the sumptuous, the extraordinary, and the alluringly unique. And among these figures, Sarah Baartman stood as a beacon. Who is Sarah Baartman? Well, if you must know, she's one of the very good examples of the harshest reality colonial enslavement as an insane social construct could beget. The life of Sarah Baartman was indeed an unspeakably dehumanizing one, to say the least. The misery of a life which was centered around the God-given natural beauty of her form. The unendurable pain of such a memory in a human being while in life. The horrible ordeal and cruelty she had to put up with, having none to save her from the living hell, but death. And even death, too, was not enough to save her from the cold, brutal hands of her colonial persecutors who had gone ahead to defy the sanctity of a resting soul, turning the lifeless corpse of the innocent young woman into a play toy after her miserable death. Not even her early death could put an end to the abuse she endured in life. It took a president's lobbying and the fight of her people to finally lay her to rest. It is indeed saddening and heartbreaking, the unspeakable story of Sarah Baartman. Welcome to the channel Black Journals. Please sit tight as we uncover the old undying story of the remarkable Sarah Baartman of the Khoikhoi tribe in South Africa. We are giving you full details. Only do not forget to appreciate our steady efforts to keep you informed by pressing the like button of this video. Share with your families and friends, and subscribe to stay with us all the way. Your support means a lot to us. Let's get to know Sarah Baartman, shall we? Born in that memorable year of 1789 near the present-day village of Hankey in rural Cape Dutch colony, Sarah's life had begun against the backdrop of a world that admired women of her form. Her ebony skin and shapely physique held an enchanting power, the allure of which wasn't lost on all the eyes that beheld her. However, her journey was destined for a path less romantic, one fraught with manipulation, exploitation, and untold cruelty. Sarah belonged to the cattle-herding Go Aquasub group of the Khoikhoi tribe, who resided in the Gamtoos Valley in the eastern Cape of South Africa. Sarah Baartman, or Sarchi, as she was often referred to, was named Sehura at birth by her Khoisan parents. Later on, she would become Sarchi, a diminutive form of Sarah in Dutch for slaves, when she became the slave property of a trader named Peter Willem Cesar. However, there's no telling the hardship and abuse which had begun quite early in Sarah's life, almost immediately after her birth. Her mother had died while she was only 2 years old, and her father had joined her mother in death later on, killed by the Bushmen, when Sarah was yet a very young girl near her adolescence. While there is strangely no specific historical record stating the cause of her mother's death, a rare documentary report concerning Sarah Baartman and the events of her time suffices to say that Sehura, later renamed Sarah, the youngest of 6 siblings comprising of 2 boys and 4 girls, had been born in a war zone. At the time of Sarah's birth, from between 0 to 2 years of her life, which could have been between the years of 1790 and 1791, the Khoikhoi people were engaged in a guerrilla war against the encroaching Europeans whose brutal arrival had shattered the peace of her community. At that time, men such as Sarah's father may have been amongst the able-bodied young men of the village who fought to resist their entrance, whilst they also lived in the mountains in fearful watch of the Dutch commando raids who had already gotten past the village perimeters and were gradually advancing inwards. Sarah's mother, on the other hand, may have been amongst the women, children, and the old ones who were left in the village to fend for themselves at the time of the war. It was said that on a certain night, the Dutch commandos had caught up with the villagers and surrounded them. They were said to have opened fire on virtually anything in sight. This was clearly a massacre, as they had continued to open fire on the surrounded villagers all through the entire night until daybreak, when the first light could be seen. They had shot at them as men who had gone on a hunt for some wild beasts and not humans. That's how the record puts it. By the time they had finished, a great many people had been killed that day, including women and children and the old aged. The men, it was said, were absent. The women had thrown up their arms for mercy, but no mercy was shown. It was a barbaric slaughter. This may have been the obvious cause behind Sarah's mother's death, leaving her daughter at such an early tender age of 2. Only a few little children had escaped, Sarah amongst them, as she may have been carried into hiding by any of her siblings who had escaped fast enough, while the rest of the children who had been captured were distributed among the Dutch commandos as new slaves. life was miserable for the Khoikhoi people following the invasion of the Dutch. Their displacement and the occupation of their land was the prerequisite for the establishment of the colony. Almost immediately, this was followed by the imposition of a system of forced labor for these populations. Although an official decree of 1654 prohibited the enslavement of the original inhabitants of the Cape, violence, physical and psychological abuse, dependency, and almost total absence of rights were the norm in the system of forced labor imposed on the Khoi people. Those coerced into this system were captured as children by groups of settlers, reduced to servitude, subjected to a pattern of debt and financial dependency, and permanently held on the land of their employers. Although the Khoi people could not be legally bought and sold, they were legally bought and sold on a practical level, and were even subjected to worse living conditions than actual slaves. This era in question speaks volumes concerning the extreme hardships and rampant abuse endured by Sarah while growing up in the uniqueness of her curvaceous figure. For a child under the state of colonial invasion, subjugation, and oppression, this was a pretty much crazy way to start out life. But here was Sarah, in her unique form, caught up in the spontaneous, doing just what she could, never knowing what was coming for her. As a child, Sarah was a normal Khoisan girl, and like most Khoisan girls, she had begun to develop statopegia, only this time it was at a pretty much early age, and this had begun to give her a well-curved hips and large protruding buttocks, which heightened her sex appeal, making her a hot target for ridicule and abuse by her enslavers. Statopegia happens to be a major characteristic well known to be rampant with the Khoikhoi women, a medical condition where a woman accumulates substantial amount of adipose tissue on the buttocks and thighs, which sometimes extends to the front of the thighs. This results in giving the woman a curvaceous figure. This physical feature had molded Sarah in an outstanding manner. She was truly a provocative beauty to behold. In her early teenage years, Sarah had married a Khoikhoi man who was a drummer. They had a child together who died shortly after birth. When Bartman was 16, her husband was murdered by Dutch colonists. Soon after, she was sold into slavery to a trader named Peter Willem Cesar, who took her to Cape Town where she became a domestic slave to his brother, Hendrik Cesar. It was during this time that she was given the name Sartje, a Dutch diminutive for Sarah. At the time Sarah arrived in Cape Town, indigenous African women were considered abnormal, inferior, and paradoxically, exotically desirable to Europeans, whom it is said have always had an obsession with the Khoikhoi females ever since they first came across them on forays into the Finbos in the 17th century. Most particularly, they were fascinated by their big buttocks and genitals. The genitals had unusually long labia, which Europeans would refer to as the Hottentot apron. This was considered to be a sign of great beauty amongst the Khoi people. The Khoi women had remarkable physical differences, and Europeans classified female Khoisians as homo monstrous. Sarah, with her honey-brown skin and other exotic features that included her characteristic Khoisan large and protruding buttocks, soon found herself the focus of curious attention in Cape Town. In 1808, Hendrik owed money to a wealthy burgher called Voss. Under pressure, he had begun to exhibit Sarah to the sick patients at the naval hospital in exchange for money. These were mostly sailors. They could view her and possibly touch her. Sarah was a Ganakwa woman, and Ganakwa women were desired by sailors. This act had gone on from the year 1808 to 1809, when Sarah's distinctly non-European look with whispers of sexual intrigue caught the eye of a military surgeon, Alexander Dunlop, who had just begun working at the hospital. Dunlop, having noticed Sarah, had immediately started negotiations with Hendrik Cesar to take Sarah to London to show her to the public there. He had introduced the idea to Sarah, persuading her with promises of fame and fortune, but she had refused, saying she would only go if Hendrik came with them as well. Hendrik had refused too, but later on agreed to Dunlop's persuasive insistence. In 1810, a pivotal year, Sarah embarked on a journey that would alter the course of her life forever. Upon her arrival in London, the city's grandeur seemed to embrace her with open arms, but the glittering exterior belied the darkness that lurked beneath. Sarah's uniqueness became her curse as she was transformed into the Hottentot Venus, an attraction that tantalized the European public's curiosity. Dunlop had to have Bartman exhibited, and Hendrik was the showman. She was first exhibited in London at the Egyptian Room, Piccadilly Circus, Cavendish Square, on November 24, 1810, as a primitive and extraordinary phenomenon of nature, exhibiting her almost naked body to anyone who was willing to pay the 2-shilling admittance fee. For a higher price, the more affluent in society could touch her. Her large buttocks, in particular, were a point of interest. London fashion at the time emphasized women's bum with extravagant bows, and Sarah's buttocks were fascinatingly inspected and secretly craved. Although it has been said that a contract of agreement was signed between Sarah and Dunlop, this is highly unlikely, as Sarah would not have been able to read or write. However, her contract allegedly stated that she would work as a domestic servant and be exhibited for entertainment purposes. For this inhuman employment, she would receive a portion of the entertainment earnings and be allowed to return to South Africa after 5 years. But Sarah never did make it home alive. Neither did she receive any portion of her earnings. Sarah Baartman was subjected to a great deal of humiliation and abuse during her time in London. She was practically displayed naked, except for a little piece of cloth which barely covered her genitals, exposing her elongated labia. Her physical features, particularly her buttocks and genitalia, were cruelly showcased, gawked and poked at by curious spectators, as if they were nothing more than commodities for public amusement. Whenever Sarah was in exhibition and didn't want to be touched, Hendrik Caesar, her handler, threatened to whip her. She lived in all respects as someone who was engaged in urban slavery. It didn't faze nor despair audience members who lapped up the show. Bartman had become one of the most famous celebrity exhibits of the 19th century. People literally lined up to poke and prod Sarah, while Dunlop and Caesar made profits off it. Bartman's exhibition, however, raised ethical concerns, leading to petitions against her treatment. The African Association, led by the British abolitionist Zachary Macaulay, initiated a release campaign in favor of Bartman following the institution of the Slave Trade Act, 1807. After tabling the matter in court, it was strange hearing Sarah's assertions, through her interpreter, stating that she was not under any form of restraint and had not been abused in any manner whatsoever, despite what had been seen already at her exhibition. She also insisted that she had traveled to London ridden by free will. Her statement also noted that she was fully aware that her employers guaranteed her half of what she accrued from displays. On this basis, she outlined her reluctance to return home, back from a journey which she had reluctantly embarked on in the first place, cutting short an attempted rescue mission by the African Association. It was not adding up. The assertion was indeed strange, for it painted Sarah as a woman with no dignity. Zachary Macaulay, who championed Sarah's cause, was a white British from Scottish descent who primarily spoke English and did not hear Dutch, which means that he could not and did not hear Sarah directly, nor could he relate directly with her. All the information he heard that day in court, which was 3 hours long as the account puts it, was from the mouth of the interpreter, who happened to be Sarah's handler, Hendrik Caesar, who may have been motivated by racism and sexism, thus had twisted Bartman's words to portray her as a subhuman creature in order to justify her exploitation, which he is, himself, a major part. Eyewitnesses on her situation had later on provided contradictory observations, indicating that she was not indeed a free woman as she claimed. However, the case had been dismissed based on the account of her interpreter, which leaves Sarah once again with her handler. The publicity given by the court case had increased Sarah's popularity as an exhibit. She later toured other parts of England and was exhibited at a fair as far away as Limerick, Ireland in 1812. After 4 years in London, in September 1814, she was transported from England to France, and upon arrival, Hendrik Caesar sold her to Sean Rowe, a man who showcased animals, after which Hendrik returned to South Africa. Sarah's suffering had pretty much intensified in the hard hands of Rowe, who exhibited her around Paris and reaped financial benefits from the public's fascination with Sarah's provocative body. Rowe exhibited her under more pressured conditions for 15 months at the Palais Royal in Paris. In France, she was in effect enslaved. In Paris, her exhibition became more clearly entangled with scientific racism. Rowe had begun exhibiting her in a cage alongside a baby rhinoceros. Her trainer would order her to sit or stand in a similar way that circus animals are ordered. At times, Bartman was displayed almost completely naked, wearing little more than a tan loincloth, and she was only allowed that due to her insistence that she cover what was culturally sacred. She was nicknamed once again Hottentot Venus. She was paraded at private gatherings and parties of the wealthy, and was the surprise at the end of a night of drinking for white elites. There she would be poked at, touched however desired by intrigued spectators. Her constant display attracted the attention of one George Cuvier, a naturalist, who had at some point experimentally danced with Sarah in one of her freak shows. He asked Rowe if he would allow Sarah to be studied as a science specimen, to which Rowe agreed. From March 1815, Sarah was studied by French anatomists, zoologists, and physiologists. They had also indicated persisting interest in her elongated labia, but Sarah had sternly refused despite the pressure. She never did allow them to examine her genitals. The most she did was let them get a painting of her nude. Cuvier concluded that she was a link between animals and humans. Thus, Sarah was used to help emphasize the stereotype that Africans were oversexed and a lesser race. Sarah faced untold hardship and humiliation while in Paris. She was said to have begun drinking and smoking heavily at the latter time of her life, which obviously was due to frustration. She had been betrayed and sold away by those who brought her to the West. Roux had used Sarah pretty much like an animal. There is some evidence to suggest that at one point a collar was placed around her neck. Specifically, she was exhibited with a collar on some occasions. She was forced to work long hours. She was not allowed to leave her cage without permission. She was sometimes not allowed to bathe or change her clothes. She was fed a poor diet and became malnourished. She was subjected to physical and sexual abuse by the public and by her handlers. She had been denied medical care as well when she became ill. Sarah Baartman had died a broken and terribly abused woman in the year 1815, December 29th, at a young age of 26, from an inflammatory disease that was believed to be related to alcoholism, syphilis, smallpox, or pneumonia. However, her agony wasn't finished yet at the hands of her enslavers. Beyond sadly, her freak show display had continued after her death. Georges Cuvier, driven by his morbid fascination for Sarah, obtained her remains from local police and subjected Sarah's lifeless body to a macabre fate. With the precision of a surgeon and the fancy of a lunatic, he had dissected Sarah's body on a cold, sterile laboratory table, stripping away the layers of her identity, reducing her to a mere collection of parts. The very essence of her existence had been violated once again, this time under the guise of scientific inquiry. After Cuvier had dissected Sarah's body, he pickled her brain and genitalia and placed them in jars on display at the Musée de l'Homme, Museum of Man, in Paris. There they remained for over a century, until the year 1974, as proof of Cuvier's theory of racial evolution. Her organs, genitalia, and buttocks were thought to be evidence of her sexual primitivism and intellectual equality with that of an orangutan, an ape. The story of Sarah Baartman had resurfaced in 1981 when Stephen Jay Gould, a paleontologist, wrote about her story in his book, The Mismeasure of Man, where he criticized racial science. Cuvier's pseudo-scientific pursuits had aimed to unlock the secrets of race and anatomy with Sarah's body. However, his methodology was as crude as it was misguided. He failed to recognize that the real enigma wasn't the structure of Sarah's body, but rather the cruelty inherent in reducing a person to an object, a spectacle, and now, a specimen. Fast forward to the year 1994, following the African National Congress, ANC's victory in the South Africa's first free and democratic elections, which had emerged Nelson Mandela as the nation's president, Mandela had requested that the French government return the remains of Sarah Baartman so that she could be laid to rest. The process had taken 8 years, years of legal wranglings, debates within the French National Assembly, and even a vote by the French Senate, as the French had to draft a carefully worded bill that would not allow other countries to claim treasures taken by the French. France finally gave in to the request on the 6th of March 2002, and 2 months later, the 3rd of May 2002, in a moving ceremony attended by many representatives of the Khoikhoi people, Sarah's remains were returned to South Africa and to her homeland in the Gamtoos Valley. There, she was given a proper burial in her native village of Hanki on the 9th day of August 2002, which happens to be Women's Day, a public holiday in South Africa. That same year, she was brought back home. That is, over 200 years after her birth. In closing, the story of Sarah Baartman is a tragic reminder of the historical injustices suffered by marginalized individuals, and it underscores the urgent need for empathy, understanding, and the dismantling of systems that perpetuate such exploitation. Remembering her ordeal should serve as a call to challenge and rectify the past, striving for a more equitable and compassionate world where every individual is treated with dignity and respect. The life of Sarah Baartman is one that would always be remembered in the African struggle for absolute emancipation from colonial interests, proddings, and control. By virtue of such a life, the Queen Sarah has become immortalized as the African symbol of irrepressible and irresistible beauty. Rest in peace, Sahura Sarah Baartman. Even in death, you will always be regarded by the living, and your life would always be a lesson teaching our discerning hearts to stand up, assume responsibility, and change the African narrative. This brings us to the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Tell us what you think in the comments section and we would readily respond. Don't forget to support our consistent efforts to keep you informed by always pressing that like button. Share with friends and family and subscribe to keep in touch with us always. Thank you for watching.